This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is the head brewer and blender for Beachwood Blendery out in Long Beach, California. Harrison McCabe, welcome to the podcast, Harrison.
Thanks for having me.
We've been super impressed with the beers you guys have been making over the last couple of years, the Beachwood Blendery, and our blind panel has loved them. So in the last issue where we covered wild and sour beers, double 100s for the Beachwood Blendery beer. I'm really excited to talk about your spontaneous process, your brewing process, then of course your blending process, fruiting and everything else. But first, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and dedication to their customers' craft. G&D is committed to cold, whether you operate a brew pub or large-scale production brewery. Contact G&D Chillers today at 1-800-555-0973 or reach out online at gdchillers.com. Mention this podcast and receive up to $1,000 worth of glycol with the purchase of any new G&D chiller. Also, stay connected to the heart of craft beer and the revolutionary tastemakers behind every can and bottle. Download the free Tavour app to get highly rated independent craft beer delivered right to your door. Recent featured beers include Within Us from Anchorage, Stargate Nectarine from Black Project, King Sue from Toppling Goliath, Ninja vs. Unicorn from Pipeworks, and Bière de Pay from Side Project. Get $10 in beer money today with code BREWING. All right, Harrison, let's talk a little bit about Beachwood Blendery and how you all have decided to make spontaneous wild and sour beer in a decidedly different kind of environment than where that style of beer has tended to originate. You were in a drier, warmer, much warmer kind of climate in Southern California, and yet you all have figured out a way to kind of make the spontaneous process work and also kind of bring along these wild and sour beers that are, to my palate, some of the best I've tasted in the country. Talk to me a little bit about how you ended up here at Beachwood, and then how that process has developed for you all.
Sure. I started at Beachwood around 4 years ago. I was working at some other local breweries, and Beachwood was looking to crank up production. So I was lucky enough to go there and work in Long Beach at the pub and train under Julian Strego and Ian McCall and Gene Wagner. And while the blendery was sort of starting up, I would be working there part-time as well. There wasn't any, real cellar work to do at that point. So we just help out here and there as Ryan Fields, the old head brewer and blender, needed help. So getting that training from those guys was honestly awesome. Just the way they think about beer and approach beer really helped shape the way Beachwood Blendery sort of approached making these lambic inspired beers, and really breaking it down into variables. And that's what beer is about, right? If it's a bunch of little things that really add up and make something that's really amazing. Everyone uses the same ingredients. You can get the same yeast. You can match water, you can do whatever you want, but it's all the tiny little things that, people don't necessarily think about that adds up and really makes an amazing beer.
Let's talk about some of those things. So, that process that Beachwood took in the kind of launching the blendery, I remember receiving some beers from you guys of the numerical series as you kind of worked through a culture. You kind of moved past that, and now, and I think the idea behind that was to build a culture. You've kind of departed from that now and are brewing spontaneously with beers like Cool Ship Chaos and Funk Yeah. Why make that shift from a kind of, a maintained culture into kind of spontaneous brewing?
So the propagation series, the numbered beers, those went over great with everyone. Real confusing, but
so not the best brand move.
I think it kind of set us back a little bit. I think a lot of people were expecting lambic inspired beers right off the bat, and we were putting out Saison and Berliner Weiss, and whereas from a commercial standpoint, it probably wasn't the best move. It really let us figure out a couple things here and there, and really figure out bottle conditioning a little bit, and working with ingredients and flavors and cultures and whatnot. I think it was really valuable as a learning tool for us while we waited for some of the lambic inspired beer to start coming online. A couple of beers that are some of our favorite, Dia de los Mangos, actually started as one of those propagation beers, and as well as Umeboshi, our sea salt and plum beer. So there's some good things that came out of that.
So you mean they came in terms of like ingredient selection, way that you're fruiting the beer after that, it's developed, or?
Well, just, playing with flavors, and, we got to do it with a Saison that was, 6 months old, and we're like, okay, well, we know how to use plums now, and the salt, like we kind of dialed in those levels a little bit. And those beers evolved from that propagation series.
Okay.
Same with Strawberry Provence, which was an accident. We had Herbes de Provence Saison and strawberry beer, and neither one was better without the other. And we put them together, like, oh, we nailed it. And it became Strawberry Provence, which is one of the, I guess, our core beers we make fairly often and really love to do.
Yeah. So then why, you were making these propagation series beers, and you were also, started brewing spontaneous beer at the same time, and we're just pushing that back into barrels to let it age before you could release it.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, we got our cool ship about a year into the blendery. We'll really started using it at that point. In the first year of cool ship beer, we dumped most of it. It was it wasn't good.
How'd you know it wasn't good? What was it? What were the flavors that you were tasting that were like, yeah, this is not going to develop? I mean, because when you start making that beer initially, it's all going to taste kind of weird at the start.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, Enterobacter is the main culprit and ruined beer. Pretty quickly within a few weeks if it's too far gone. We weren't pre-acidifying at that point. It smells like rotting cabbage, and it has a bitterness to it as well. In large amounts, that character is not desirable, but in small amounts, it adds a little bit of earthy nuance and texture. So I mean, we lost a third of our spontaneous beer for, I don't know, two and a half years, I would say.
Yikes! Now that enteric kind of phase, for spontaneous beer, from the studies that I've read, it is actually a rather important part of the flavor development. What's not happening is other organisms out competing and then taking over from that phase, and then just letting it linger and grow.
Right. I mean, so one cool thing, if you pre-acidify, the Enterobacter is pretty much held at bay. You're not really going to get much of it. But so we learn how to mimic spontaneous fermentation with pitching culture. We can make Enterobacter tasting beer if we want.
Yeah.
We wanted to understand all the variables and how to achieve certain things in making all kinds of sour beer. We can make American style sour beer. We can adjust a few variables with our culture, and it'll taste very different. It won't resemble what we usually put out. We can make Enterobacter. We can do a lot of cool things just based on what we've learned and observed over time. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to talk about some of those levers that you pull, but let's talk about pre-acidification, first. And this is one that I think is a kind of interesting process for spontaneous brewing to kind of, get it down to a kind of pH level where some of the less desirable, bacteria can't grow and flourish in that. And it's something I know that, the Referend does up in New Jersey. There are a number of brewers that are now doing it this way. Talk to me a little bit about the way that you pre-acidify, what your goals are on that, and how you do it.
We just target around 4.6 to 4.8 lactic acid in our whirlpool, and that's pretty much how we get there. We don't do it for most of our beer. It's pretty much only beer that sees the cool ship. We're doing some fermentations now with just fruit, and we treat that sort of like cool ship where it doesn't get cooled in the cool ship, but we'll pre-acidify it just to keep some of those off flavors from popping up. And we're having pretty good results with that so far.
Just straight lactic acid in the boil.
Yeah. It's not that much.
Okay.
Yeah. and most of the time our pHs are just normal, standard 5.3-ish pH for wort.
You're not trying to do it the acid malt kind of way to claim that there's no additional anything added to the beer?
You can do it if you want.
Yeah. In an environment like Los Angeles or LA metro area, are you then able to how is there a culture and positive kind of culture that creates the kind of flavors you want in the environment that you've now built a cool ship brewery in? How have you developed that kind of space, or what kind of environmental controls do you put in place to, again, kind of make sure that in this very warm environment you're getting the kinds of flavors through these cool ship beers that you want to get?
So from the beginning, the building was built out with this in mind. We have humidity, temperature control. That's those are some crazy things that we can do. Like we can cool ship kind of whenever we want, and make a decent product at this point. But the idea from the beginning was to create our own environment where, cool ship beer would thrive. So cool ship beer, it's stuff from the air, but it's also from what's around it. It's in it's a sense of place, I guess.
Sure.
And over time, we're seeing the spontaneous beer become better and better, and that's probably just because it's building up in the blendery itself. It's on the barrels, the walls, it's around kind of thing. We've also stopped sanitizing as heavily.
Yeah.
We sanitize our tanks, but parts, if we sanitize them, we're using just SaniClean, which is just kind of a final rinse sanitizer. It's not parasitic or anything like that. And that kind of works against what we're trying to do. You want to be somewhat clean, I guess.
Clean-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So over time, we've seen the environment get more conducive to those spontaneous fermentations. We've done cool ship beer throughout the year at different temperatures to see what it does. And some of the challenges of that too is, if we do it in a warmer month, it acidifies a lot quicker, and the beer is really good at 1 year, but it's not really going to go past that. You have to use it at that point. So learning how to make beer that can sit for a couple of years is also kind of a challenge, I suppose, at this point.
Come back to that, but let's talk a little more about the environment. I like what you're saying in terms of building that culture up in the brewery, and I mean we see it. Is up at Area 2. Phil Markowski of Two Roads, has built a new cool ship with a gorgeous ceiling, angled in so that that condensation will gather on the ceiling and also potentially drip back into the cool ship, pushing that in. And, Crooked Stave is doing a lot of beers through their cool ship. Same kind of thing, built a kind of pine ceiling right above the open cool ship. And if you go look at it, you can find these kind of caramelized, almost like sugar droplets hanging off of the roof. But it provides an environment for those kinds of bugs and the stuff that you want to kind of live in. How have you guys kind of built an environment around that?
We used to have lattice above the cool ship. It got moldy pretty quick, and we decided to pull it down.
Yeah.
I'm sure it might help. I don't know if anyone's collected the drippings and had it, tested for microorganisms. Right. Maybe it's a thing. We've got the way our building's cooled is we have fans in opposite sides of the buildings blowing in sort of a vortex. So you can see when we cool ship, the steam is going towards the wall, towards the cool ship, from the barrels basically. So the direction of the air is going to the cool ship.
Okay.
Which is pretty cool. We also have air intake from outside. We've stopped using that. What we felt like was happening was it was actually pushing too much air in and pushing things away from the cool ship from the barrel room.
Okay.
So we've done experiments with it on and off, but I think we've settled on off. I mean, there's air coming in just through convection, but we don't blow air in from outside anymore.
It kind of challenges that romantic notion of culture floating in over in the evening breeze into the cool ship. But I also don't think that kind of romantic idea was ever really real, and even in actual lambic.
I think a lot of people get the impression that it's only the air and whatever's in the air really ferments the beer, but there's really things built up in the brewery, in hoses and barrels and parts, and those breweries don't necessarily have crazy sanitation practices. Things build up over time, and things are kind of active all the time too during the brewing season. So Yeah, I'm not gonna say it's all from the air, but
So what temperature do you generally try to keep the cool ship and the general area with your barrels at?
So we create artificial seasons in our barrel house.
Okay.
We're in California. It's 68 every day and sunny. It gets warm a few months a year. September is actually usually the warmest month for us. And right now we're at 66, which is our kind of like temperature we've settled on over the last few years, where we don't get as much like early lactic acid production, which has like a sort of lemony kind of character. It's really not what we want in the beer. And that's our high temp for right now. And then as we get closer to December and January, we'll slowly crank down to about 48 degrees. And we get usually around 50, just depending on the outside. Our building's not super insulated, so it's kind of hard to keep it real cool for a long time. But I've seen it get around 50 degrees for the most part.
Let's talk about that development of lactic acid in time. You mentioned when it's warmer that some of the beers develop acidity faster, but then don't develop some of the funk and complexity that you might want over that kind of extended aging. What have you found makes for that most interesting beer, and what are those levers that you pull in order to kind of what are you looking for at various stages as the beer develops? How much acid are you looking over specific amounts of time, and and how do you again kind of tweak the variables in order to achieve those things?
Sure. So I guess the variables for acid production, hops, temperature, those are the main two, I guess.
Yeah.
So most of our beers hop pretty heavily. We're using over half a pound per barrel, like 0.7 pounds per barrel, I guess, mostly. If we want
Aged hops or
all
fresh?
aged hops,
Okay.
so they're noble varieties that were aged as whole leaf and then pelletized.
Okay.
For us. We can go on to hops later.
Cool.
That's kind of something we're looking into right now because finding good bad hops is an odd question to ask some of these
bad hops. Yeah.
ask these hop growers. They're like, no one's ever asked us that before. But yeah, so hops and temperature, and also pitching rates and cleaning your barrels, and those are things that adjust acid. So we used to make acid beer. We'd hop it half pound per barrel or lower, and just from that alone, we would see like a lot different profile in lactic acid production. And what happens is the beer acidifies so quickly that there's a lot of flavors and nuance that you kind of strip out of the beer over time with that. And also it kind of like tends to go acetic faster because that environment's more conducive for acetobacter once the pH starts dropping really fast. And temperature, we generally knock out at 65. If we start knocking out above 67 or so, we start seeing that kind of lactic acid production as well, even though we hop like fairly high. So there's kind of that sweet spot of the hop rate and the temperature to kind of like dial in that acid profile.
So what temperature you put it into the cool ship at?
204 degrees.
Okay. And you pull it out of the cool ship then at 66.
It's like 62 out of a cool ship.
Okay.
Only 10% of our production is spontaneous beer right now.
Okay.
I don't know if we package that much, but as like a production of wort right now, it's about 10%.
Okay.
And actually the first batch of every year we'll go into the cool ship, put it in barrels and pitch culture into it. There is a flavor from the cool ship that you do not get from even pitching really low. It's hard to describe it. It's a little oxidized, a little earthier, but it's unique to the cool ship. So we like to have some of that like hybrid beer around, and we generally blend some of that into Funkia because we want some of that character from the cool ship.
So you're pulling these levers. You're putting a fairly significant amount of hops in there to kind of make sure that those lactic acid bacteria are working slowly. What do you do to kind of push that funky element up? I mean, I think that's one of the things that differentiates the sour beer that you and other top producers in the United States are making from some of the more general average American wild ales that, that have a more one-dimensional kind of, component to them. There's this minerally funk, that you all are able to kind of capture, that just adds this kind of depth. And it's almost like, salt, that it kind of brings out some of that acidity and highlights some of that fruit, makes everything a little brighter and a little, more bold and interesting. How do you, where does that come from, and how do you favor that through your process?
So from the beginning, we started with tons of Belgian origin cultures and yeasts from labs, bottles, and whatever. At one point, we had 20 carboys, we had incubators. Like we had because the building is sometimes really cold, so we'd want the yeast, at a little bit warmer temperature.
Yeah.
And we'd pitched all these cultures into barrels at different amounts, different variations. And then over time, we would just, taste barrels and be like, oh, this one's in the right direction. And we'd actually sacrifice that whole barrel, like literally the best barrel we had, into a fresh batch of wort. And then that would go into barrels. And maybe some of them we pitch some more stuff or whatever. And just through selection over time, we kind of guided the culture in the funky direction. It took about 2.5 to 3 years to kind of get that consistency with that. But a lot of it was just through like selection of the right barrels and pushing those to like further the program on. At this point, when we blend Funk Yeah and our new 3-year spontaneous goose inspired beer, we're using the beer itself with a little wort and using that to like as our culture going forward. So that's kind of the way we've gotten to where we are with that.
Let's talk a little bit more about that in a second. But first, craft the perfect pour with superior fruit from the perfect puree. Picked at the peak of ripeness, the fruit is pureed and packed for optimal fresh flavor and color. But don't just take their word for it. Experience flavor firsthand by curating your own complimentary sample box at perfectpuree.com/beer. That's perfect, PUREE.com/beer. Samples are complimentary for brewing professionals only. And balancing barley and hops is your expertise, and for Clarion Lubricants, food-grade lubricants is theirs. The team at Clarion knows that when it comes to making great beer, you're the expert, and when it comes to supplying food-grade lubricants backed by service-oriented professionals, they're the experts. Clarion will work with you to create an efficient lubrication program that helps protect your brewery. To speak with an expert, dial 1-855-MY-CLARION, that's 855-692-5274, or visit clarionlubricants.com. Clarion Lubricants, the expert that experts trust. So, fostering that kind of funk in the in the brew house, you mentioned that you are kind of moving some of the stuff you like into some of the places, into some of the other beers in order to kind of keep some of that character going. How does that jive with the whole spontaneous process? Obviously, spontaneous is only 10% of what you're brewing, but how through that spontaneous process are you picking up some of the same things?
So we're trying to mimic the flavors of spontaneous fermentation. So when we were guiding the culture, we've kind of
mimic the flavors of Belgian spontaneous
beer. So, with that in mind, in our idea of lambic and goose, we guided our culture in that direction. So the idea was that we're pitching to mimic those flavor profiles. So I think the similarities are going to be strong just because of that. I will say the cool ship beer tastes different than the pitched beer always.
Yeah.
It's not as fruity, I would say. But I mean, they both have similar funky character. Some of that comes from ingredients. So we found that unmalted wheat actually promotes the funky kind of character. So that's really important. The aged hops, again, are also like really important in part of that. But a lot of it's fermentation and, in time. I think, the mash profile or whatever helps a little bit with some of that character. We're mashing pretty hot, like 156, 158, no rest time, and a 193 Fahrenheit sparge. So we want these fermentations to last a year. So you don't really want the yeast to dominate or the bacteria. And that's also,
right,
hand in hand with our temperature, our seasons that we create in the blendery.
Right.
So we want warmer and cooler fluctuations through that year. You got to look at the fermentation over a long period of time versus a really short period of time. If your fermentation finishes in 2 months, your beer is going to go acetic eventually because nothing's really active at that point. It goes kind of dormant.
How do you carry that funk character that you're looking for that's Belgian inspired through that spontaneous beer? Is it picking it up just, from the brew house itself, or, is there some more intentional way that those flavors are getting into the beer?
I mean, we make honest, spontaneous beer. Like the barrels, all of our barrels, every brew, no matter spontaneous or not, are steamed and power washed with hot water. Like we've put beer, like wort into the barrels to see like, is there stuff still in the barrels? And we've never made anything good doing that. It never gets sour. It just tastes weird, and it's probably not good to drink. So a lot of it's through blending, honestly. We make Funk Yeah, which is a blend of spontaneous, not spontaneous, cultured beer. We also made our new beer. It's called We Are Who We Pretend to Be, and it's a 3-year spontaneous beer. So you can try our cultured version versus the spontaneous version. We made 2 like 3-year inspired beers. We tasted hundreds of barrels to select maybe, I think 20 total, like 9 for one beer and 11 for the other one. A lot of that character comes through blending as well. Like not every barrel is crazy funky or right. It never happens really where you get that one barrel it's got everything, it's perfectly balanced with acidity and funk and, texture. A lot of, those flavors are through blending, and it's interesting because the actual blend age of both of these beers happen to work out to be the same. So I don't know if that was just, we have this idea of what a 3-year beer is supposed to taste like, and we're blending to that. So these beers have like similar acid profiles and characters. They're just a little bit different from each other. So I think it's really cool that, a consumer could try, it's method traditional because we wanted to learn that mashing that way doesn't make those flavors. Like, that's why it was important to us to do that. And that beer just happens to fall on the method traditional thing. So sure, we'll put it on the label. And then Funk Yeah, it's made the way we think we can make the best beer possible. So I don't know.
That's actually a cool thought. So you are adhering with some of the beers coming out of the blendery to method traditional, but then you're also making beers that don't adhere to that because you're developing another process that's different than that method traditional process that helps you make beer that tastes a little bit closer to what your flavor profile is. I think philosophically that's a interesting standpoint to take, and the other brewers like Trevor Degard kind of take the same kind of thing. I'm not going to adhere to some list of the way that I have to make it in order to put a logo on a label. I'm going to make spontaneous beer the way that I need to make it here in my local environment in a way that makes the best beer, the beer that tastes the way I want it to taste. I think those are certainly fair concerns, and it's there's nothing more American than trying to do it our own way, taking an inspiration from somewhere else, but also, figuring out the processes that work and the same processes that work, in the heat of Texas or in the warmth of Southern California, may not work in the damp coast of Oregon, mm-hmm. or, they may be different than what works in the kind of humid Sun Valley. So, what in that sense, is there a future for method traditional for you, or are you now kind of moving past and that you've learned what you need to learn from that, going in your own direction?
I don't think it's not necessarily my decision to make alone. I want to talk to everybody at the company and be like, hey, like, I don't think this is the best way for us to make spontaneous beer. I'm probably going to move away from it. I think the next couple of years of beers might still fall under that designation.
Because you made them that way and
we've made them that way for the last 4 years. But it was really important, to make things the way they've been traditionally made and explore those variables again and make sure that we know what it does before we decide we don't need to do it.
So you learned then that it's not the mash that creates the funk, that it is that fermentation kind of process. What else did you learn from their method traditional experiments?
It's a little bit of both. The mash, it does make a difference, but I think you can achieve...
There's the thick dextrinous mash with, lots of hard to ferment stuff that kind of stretches out that fermentation process.
Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit system dependent, right? So for us, we're seeing that the spontaneous beer typically comes out a bit thinner than our cultured beer that's mashed differently, and we actually prefer that sort of texture and body in those beers versus some of our spontaneous stuff, which is a tiny bit thinner occasionally.
What's the difference in the mash process that you guys prefer now for your own non-method traditional stuff?
So our preferred mash is just a single infusion, real hot, 158. We recirc for 10 minutes and then start sparging and running off. And that's it. I mean, we get like a really long fermentation that way. The beer, after 4 months even, it's not even like half attenuated. Like we're also pitching really low, which is we found really important too. And, when you pitch higher, like you just kind of ferment all the sugar out, and just some things go dormant. It's just not like an active thing for a long time, and that's where the nuance comes in.
So, for these beers that you're pitching, and you say you pitch low, are you? I mean, these are mixed cultures, I assume. And so how are you, cell counting, it doesn't happen the same kind of way that you would, count in a kind of monoculture, single culture yeast. How do you know, and measure these kinds of volumes? Do you have a general, are you just doing it out of experience? I know if we push this kind of volume or weight into it, that it's, this is what's going to be low, or this is what's going to be high.
Yeah. In the beginning we tried different amounts all the time. And now we've kind of settled on like 2 liters of carboy culture per oak barrel. And that's the sweet spot. But it also depends how active it is. So if we topped it, like say we brewed last week and we topped it up and it's actively fermenting, I'll be like, okay, well, I only need a liter because it's already kind of going. If we pitch real low, that's when we can get the Enterobacter character, and we do it occasionally because I like to have a little bit of it around. Not everyone likes that flavor, but they don't know if I blend it in because it's so low, and I don't know, it just adds a cool complexity sometimes.
How do you maintain that culture? That's certainly a challenge. These things can drift over time. That they're living organisms, and they compete, and they can outcompete, and move in directions that may not be ideal. It's hard to kind of bank these mixed cultures and then grow them up in some sort of way, off of banked, because stuff grows at different rates. So how over the long, you're hinging an entire sour, wild, funky beer program on these flavors that you've worked very hard to develop. How do you keep that going?
Through selection. So, the simple answer is, we brew a few times a month, and we'll top it with generally higher hopped wort because we don't want it going acidic. Bacteria can easily kind of overpower everything else, and then just bad things happen. You'll get nail polish and vinegar. And, things do change, but through blending, we can select all of the best barrels in our entire barrel house and put them together and be like, that's awesome. Let's make our beer taste like that. So we use that to push the culture along again. So through selection.
So you almost use the good results to reset from time to time and make sure that that is, so then put back into that carboy and outcompete some of the older other stuff because it's fresher and more lively.
Yeah, our carboy shattered a few months ago, and I was like, cool. And I just walked over to a few barrels, tasted them, tastes good. And then I started a new one, and smelling the barrels, and in a month in, I'm like, cool, that's awesome. That's where we want to be. So it lives in the barrel house, and we pick the best barrel. For a while, it was kind of hard because we didn't have that much beer, and we're taking literally the best beer we have and just putting it in a wort and hoping that it works out for us. And so I think it has.
Let's talk a little bit about hops. You kind of touched on it before, but you're using aged hops, aged as whole flower, and then pelletized, and then used in the boil, and that way. What have you found in sourcing hops that you like and that you don't like? And obviously there's lots of talk among brewers that a lot of that kind of fun, kind of cheesy character out of what we get in in this kind of wild, sour, and spontaneous beer is actually hops derived in some sort of way. How do you select and use hops in order to highlight that kind of character that you're looking for?
So I would never describe the hops that we're using as cheesy. I think they're beyond that at this point.
Beyond cheesy.
Beyond cheesy. So it mostly smells like dead grass and like 1,000 wet puppies.
Okay.
Is how I would describe it.
1,000 wet puppies.
1,000 wet puppies. Especially when we cool ship the whole building, like it stings. It's like a puppy party in there. So we're kind of coming up on 4 years, and we bought a huge lot of all the aged hops from one supplier because we didn't know if they were going to be made again, and we're like, this is kind of important for our program.
Yeah.
So now we're having to find new old hops, and we're starting to do a lot more analytical things that we haven't done on hops before. So we're testing our wort IBUs. We're going to test the final beer IBUs and kind of see, like, is it an IBU thing that keeps acidity at bay, or is it just sort of the other things that are in hops from a volume standpoint? And then what's happening to these hops? So I think we're trying to tag along on the hazy IPA hop research thing where the biotransformation, and we're going to be like, hey, we have these aged hops. Like, what happens to these compounds through fermentation? I think that's like a really valuable thing to learn and know about. And it doesn't seem like people have answers yet. But anyway, getting back to like the funky character, it does have an earthy, funky thing going on. It's not necessarily the sole reason the beer is funky, but it doesn't hurt. It definitely needs to be in there, and it needs to be old noble hops. I think you can make really cool beer with low alpha American hops, and you'll get different character. It won't taste like it came from Belgium, but it might be really good.
Yeah.
So I think that's something we'd like to try. Especially with the cryo hops now, they pull out of the oils and then there's like leftover matter. I'm like, that's kind of perfect actually. So those might work out really well if we get to age those. We want to try and learn as much as we can and try things.
So you've certainly learned by using some different hops. What did you learn? What kind of flavors do you get out of those not noble hops or not aged hops?
If the hop is higher than like 3.5% when it's fresh, it's not going to work as good. I don't know, there's something about it. It's just way too bitter, and it doesn't come across right. It's too much. What was the rest of the question?
Are there any flavor contributions from non-noble hops that you've learned from over your test processes?
We've tried some American hops. Like we've tried old Cascade, and they're just like crazy citrus peel. But again, just way too bitter and like almost unusable. We'd have to blend them out like a lot to make it palatable even.
So you're using a lot of hops, but you're using very low alpha hops, to do that. And you mentioned you're studying the IBU contribution. What is your typical IBU goal, for these hops? Although I guess that's hard to say really when you're talking about aged hops where there's been a significant amount of degradation to the hop.
So we just tested the new lot. We've tested all the lots of hops we have right now, and the new hops, they tested like 1.2 alpha or something. We're getting like 60 IBUs at half a pound per barrel, and we're like, doesn't make sense. So there's like, I guess I don't know all the science behind it yet. I don't want to like make statements, but things become more soluble as they get older and oxidize. So you can get more out, like alpha acids and beta acids out of the hops when they get older, kind of thing. We're not quite sure yet. That's something we're looking into. But
it's like increases extraction efficiency or
something.
Yeah,
as much as we want to like science the beer, it's at the end of the day, it's sensory based. So I get these new hops in, and I'm going by smell and just a feel of what's been working for us. And the noble hop just has that right character. Even though maybe they're not as old and they're a little green looking still, not brown and red. Like, cool, I want those. I'll age them out a little bit more, and it'll be fine.
Do you guys age again at your own facility, or are you buying everything pre-aged?
It's pre-aged, and we're aging it further.
Yeah.
We just cut all the bags open, and they're just hanging out in the attic next to the glycol chiller. It's like 120 degrees in there.
Nice. Nice.
We used to have an incubator that we had like a heater in, and like we'd cook them literally. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about blending. Obviously, Beachwood Blendery, it's in the name, and you were mentioning earlier that a lot of the character that you're looking for, doesn't come in that single barrel. That what you are achieving is because is coming from that kind of blend of multiple barrels. As you all are tasting through barrels and trying to kind of in your mind build a blend, what are some of those kind of key differentiating flavors that you taste? Do you use a kind of shorthand to describe the flavors in specific barrels? How do you, it's the hardest thing in the world to kind of articulate in words what you're tasting in these kinds of things. But do you have a system for doing that, to try to identify, how much, what these different things are tasting like, what you think they might add to a blend, and then, and what kind of quantities you want to blend the different barrels of these different characters?
Sure. Blending's honestly the funnest part of the job. It's awesome. Like, every time it's going to be different. You really never know what you're going to taste or find. Right. So our blending process, typically we're blending 40 barrels at a time, or tasting through 40 barrels. We'll pull samples and lay them across a table, and we'll go through each one, and basically we just decide, do we like it or do we not like it? Or if it's not ready or something. So if it's good and we like it, we pull it forward, and we go through all of the barrels and just pull all the ones forward that we like. And then from there, we kind of build the blend. I do have shorthand.
So first it's like a like-dislike kind of binary,
yep.
And then you kind of hone down from there.
Right.
What happens to the barrels you don't like?
It really depends.
Fruit beer, right?
So, we put really...
Just kidding.
We make a lot of fruit beer, and honestly, we put some of the best barrels into fruit beer, and like, all right. It hurts a little bit, but we're like, okay, it's gonna be the best fruit beer ever. It happens every month. We're just like, and the thing. So anyway, we'll get to that. Yeah. But the shorthand really is acid and character and texture. So I think texture is kind of the next level of things that we think about when we're blending. It makes a big difference in the beer and how things come across. But
texture in what way?
In tannins and bitterness, body of the beer. Different acids have different mouthfeels. So, layering those acids in certain amounts really, it helps build the beer in a way where the acid hits all the parts of the tongue. It carries through the flavor. I think it's a little bit overlooked maybe in some blends. You do need acetic acid in low amounts to sort of have the carry through, and the lactic acid, it'll carry on the front of the tongue more. It's a cool thing.
Yeah.
But basically we check acid level. It's medium plus, a tiny bit of acetic acid. We mark it as acetic, and then we'll move on. Is it funky? Is it clean? Is it fruity? There's a lot of shorthand, and it's fun because we taste these 40 barrels, and those notes are only worth it for they only work for a month, and then you really need to retaste everything because things change that fast.
Yeah.
We've set barrels aside. We're like, oh, this is gonna be perfect for this blend. In a month and a half, we go back and we're like, it's not right at all. It's kind of like getting a different set of paints every time, and figuring out how to paint that picture.
Well, at least you have a lot of pigments to work with. Yeah. And so, how often do you taste those barrels? How often are you, kind of writing those notes down? And do you, are you using that kind of tasting to measure where each barrel is, and some timing on when those things need to happen too?
No, we look at, we have barrel software, and we look, okay, these barrels are a year old, time to taste them. And we'll go through all the barrels that are that age. And typically we know what beers we need to make, and we'll kind of blend towards those. Most of the blends for us, it's 7 or 6 oak barrels for a single batch, and 10 or 11 for a double batch. Yeah. We have so much barrel stock at this point, like we can make awesome blends pretty consistently. It's not that often where we fail at a blend, but it does happen where you just don't have the right pieces, and you have to go back and check old notes and look for other barrels and be like, okay, I don't have that really funky barrel that I need for this beer. Or if it's a lot of barrels, you have to come back another day and do it. So Funky, for example, it's 4 days of blending to make that beer. It's a ton of barrels to taste through and kind of sort down to the best, 12 or whatever. It's a lot of work. Yeah.
How do you do that? How do you keep your palate fresh? I mean, tasting that many barrels, it's really easy to, to have things to wreck your own palate and not be able to, have that kind of sensitivity to it. It's also, is it a single person process, or is it a more collaborative process for you all?
It's definitely collaborative. If it's like a massive tasting, like for Funkia, the first day we go through 40 to 60 barrels, and it's just like good, not ready, or not right for this beer. And then we keep narrowing it down. And then the last day we bring in people from our brewery that have awesome palates and know the beer really well, and we'll sit down and taste through everything and sort of blend that way. And the spontaneous is like a whole nother it's like a whole nother brewery within a brewery. The barrels taste nothing really like the cultured beer. Like, you taste flavors, you're like, I have no idea how or why this is. Sometimes good, sometimes it's foul, and you're just like, I don't know what would happen with this. But it's definitely a challenge to do that. And then also, when you start blending,
what's your success to failure ratio on on the spontaneous beer barrels?
I'd say we lose like a third every year.
A third, okay.
Yeah, which is, as total production, it's not really that bad.
Yeah.
Like on our cultured side, we lose like one batch out of 50 a year, maybe.
Yeah.
It's like pretty good. Occasionally,
sure.
A barrel gets lost or forgotten about, and it goes acetic. We're like, it's fine. Yeah, we dump beer. We dumped like 30 barrels this year, just older saison, things like that. It's just like, we have nothing to use this with, or like, it's not worth blending it out.
Yeah.
It's not what we're trying to make anymore, and it's not right. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about fruit process. We joked about it before with but some of the kind of flavor combinations and fruiting processes, you do make some pretty significantly fruited beers. Talk to me a little bit about what you've learned through your research on what creates successful fruited beers, methods, and selecting fruit, etc.
Sure. Don't use fruit to cover up things. That's number one. Make a good beer first and then put it on fruit. Most of the beer we blend, we don't blend different fruits typically. We're looking for funky. We're looking for the right acid profile, like moderate. Maybe acetic acid. We don't put it in a lot of the 1 year beer if we don't have to. It doesn't feel right sometimes.
What's not right about it?
It's just too much acid. And especially with the fruit, it comes across as just like harsh, I guess. It's not pleasant in our opinion.
Is it just like fruit acidity on top of beer acidity that just creates too much acidity overall?
Yeah, I would say most fruit, it adds some acid, but it's not usually like, oh, this beer is going to be way too sour because of this fruit, with the exception of apricots and passion fruit, which are always really acidic, like more acidic than you think they would be. So apricot's the one where we definitely blend really, really low acid beer in.
Okay.
But everything else, it's pretty much blended the same way. We got some funk, we got a little bit of lactic acid, some nice like aged hop character. And most of our fruit is whole fruit. The only puree we really use is passion fruit. It's accessible and it's really, really good, even though it's like a concentrated version. So we do whole fruit. We go into purged oak barrels that have just been cleaned, fruit it, purge it again.
You're fruiting in oak?
Yep.
Okay.
Everything is fruited in oak and fermented in oak.
Why that? Why not in steel tanks?
Well, now that you ask. So again, it comes down to blending. So we have 3 opportunities to blend these beers when we fruit them. So we make an initial blend, and we leave about 1.5 feet of headspace in all these barrels and ferment all the fruit for a month. And we'll taste through all of them again. And we can decide again what barrels to top them with. So we can make another set of adjustments on acid and funk and character. And then after another month of re-fermentation, we'll go through and taste all of them again. And we can blend it back, or if we need to add more fruit, we can, and just refruit it, which doesn't really happen. We kind of fruit on the lower level, I would say, for a lot of things. Like, we still want it to taste like beer. But there's a huge advantage to be able to adjust those blends that many times. I think it's a little bit more work and time consuming, but I think the results are so much better.
Why do it that way and not just after that barrel is done fruiting, blend with a barrel that's been done a completely different way, to kind of go halvesies on that. I mean, it just seems like that's a pretty work intensive process to be pouring more beer into a already fruited barrel.
It is a lot of work, but I wouldn't do it any other way, to be honest with you. Like, throw in all of the fruit and beer.
And you're not worried about like additional oxygen pickup or some of the other stuff that happens every time you open those things up?
No, I mean, we purge heavily before fruiting and after. The fruit can trap oxygen in the barrel. So we do the purge before and after. And, a month into that, like, the headspace is pretty much all CO2. If you put your nose in there, it burns. So we don't really worry about too much oxygen pickup. We've never seen, like, a barrel go, like, super acetic, super fast. And also, acetobacter is like a temperature thing. We don't get warm enough to really favor that in our beer. After a year of fermentation, like, acetobacter is pretty dormant at that point for us. We have to find acetic acid most of the time. It's not like around all that often.
What do you mean find acetic acid?
Like, literally, like, taste through a bunch of barrels and maybe
just find the one that has some acetic characters so that you can add it to a blend.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we only use the ones that have just a hint of acetic acid, like just above threshold. Anything more than that, we just dump it. It's too much and not worth it.
So you doing any kind of like punch down, or are you just cutting up whole fruit or getting it already pre-cut? What's that look like?
We don't cut anything. We just shove it in the barrel.
Just shove whole fruit in the barrel?
Yeah, we just through the bunghole. You don't, like, if you cut it up.
Skin on, or?
Yeah, pits and everything. Pits, in 2 months, it's not really going to add a ton of flavor.
Yeah.
If you longer contact, you'll get a little bit of like that nutty kind of thing. It's not something that we necessarily want in the beer, but some people like it.
Yeah.
We just shove it in. I mean, it's actually easier to separate the beer from the fruit at that point. We just push everything into a fermenter and use thyme and the cone and dump it out. And our yields are really good. Like, there's really no beer left in the barrel at that point. It's working well for us, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah.
What other anything new on the horizon that you're really excited about? New processes, new beers. What's the stuff that's getting you excited these days that you're embarking in?
Well, we're actually putting out our collab beer we did with Shacksbury Ciders today. They sent us culture from their wild apple program, and we fermented our wort with it. So it's kind of this really interesting hybrid fermentation beer, but it tastes like a Basque cider. It doesn't have any of the. It's hard to describe it. Like, the texture is different, the flavors are different from our beer, like, drastically. It's just a really cool beer. It came out really awesome. Like, it's very different from anything we've ever made. And I think in terms of understanding, like, these fermentations and our wort, it was really cool, like, success that we've had doing something very different. Again, with that, like, fermenting with just fruit is something we're really, like, excited about. I think you get really different and unique beers from those. The more saison-like, I would say, than like lambic or goose tasting, but really interesting, awesome stuff.
Interesting. So you're doing, are you pressing juice then and fermenting fruit juice separately from beer, or what are you talking about when you say fermenting fruit differently than beer?
Oh, so like we'll brew a batch of wort and we'll shove 10 pounds of peaches in it, and whatever's on the peaches will ferment the beer.
Using that culture off of okay.
So it'll have a very different terroir than, beer we make spontaneously or whatever. I think it's a really cool way to make unique tasting beers.
Cool. Well, Harrison McCabe, thanks for joining me on the podcast. If people want to learn more about Beachwood Blendery, where do they find you guys?
BeachwoodBBQ.com. Our website's pretty good. Our Instagram, Beachwood Blendery. Those are the best places. You ask questions, they'll go to me at some point. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to try some of the beers that you brought to share with me, and it's a little early in the morning for us to be drinking, and I have no glasses around here, but we'll find some before we get out of here. G&D Chillers is committed to cold. Download the Tavour app and get great craft beer delivered to your door. Brewing pros, curate your own sample box at perfectpuree.com. And Clarion Lubricants is the expert that experts trust. If you've enjoyed this conversation and the other ones that we put out here on the podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, and become a subscriber. It's kind of like a Patreon, except we send you a magazine every 2 months. And we have our annual Best in Beer issue coming up on November 1st. Subscribers will get the first access, first crack at that through our device apps on iOS and Android. And of course, on November 1st, we'll have a special edition of the podcast with our best in beer as we run through all of the winners and our logic and reader's choice and everything behind it. So it's going to be a fun episode. Tune in for that. And, who knows? There might be some Beachwood Blendery beer that shows up here and there and that. Thanks a lot, Harrison, for joining me on the podcast. Cheers.
Thanks, Sam. Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.